What kind of wedding leaves an entire crowd silent, not for the beauty of the ceremony, but because of the woman they didn't want to see? She arrived quietly, while silk skirts swished and champagne glasses clinked beneath crystal chandeliers hung from century-old flamewood trees. The guests were too wrapped in their own self-importance to notice the woman in the navy blue dress. But by the end of the night, they would remember her, and only her. The setting was lavish. The wedding of Leary Vexmore and Sorian Halbridge, hosted at the legendary estate of Valebrook Crest. White magnolias lined the marble paths, and gold-dusted canapes floated on trays carried by silent-footed waiters. The music was subtle, the lighting soft, the wealth overwhelming. Leary, radiant in a bespoke couture gown, was heiress to the Vexmore shipping empire. Sorian, or Groom, was a rising tech magnate known as much for his charm as his billion credit app empire. Their union had dominated the tabloids for weeks, but it wasn't their love story people would remember. That IT was the moment Marlene Wilkes arrived. She stepped out of a matte black Striver sedan, her silver hair gleaming beneath the setting sun. Sorian greeted her instantly, leaving behind a senator mid-conversation. He took her hand like it was something sacred. Marlene, his grandmother, his foundation. She wore a simple, graceful dress, her eyes warm but wise. She had crossed a lifetime of storms to reach this moment. Yet as she walked through the sea of guests, it became painfully clear the Vexmores hadn't prepared a seat for her at their table. Lady Valencia Vexmore stood by the floral arch, her ruby necklace catching the light. Her gaze dropped to Marlene's shoes, then rose with a smirk. "Interesting choice," she murmured to a cousin. "Didn't realize we were doing civilian chic." Polite chuckles, sideward glances, the usual mask of aristocratic cruelty. Marlene heard every word. She said nothing. Heron Vexmore, the patriarch, barely nodded her way. No greeting, no welcome, just the kind of indifference that stung more than insult. Others followed his lead. Quiet dismissals, veiled whispers, backs turned in practiced unison. Sorian clenched his jaw. "It's all right," Marlene whispered, patting his hand. "We're not here to teach the manners. Not yet." When she took her seat, far from the family dais, the distance was physical as well as symbolic. Guests subtly shifted away. Her words were met with stiff smiles, her compliments ignored, even when she simply reached for a pastry. Valencia turned away in visible disgust. But Marlene, steady as ever. She had lived through harder silences than this that a man watched from the perimeter. Older, impeccably dressed in a charcoal coat with brushed brass buttons. His name was Osric Marrow. Few recognized him. Fewer still knew his influence. But his gaze missed nothing. He noticed the disdain on Valencia's face, the empty chair beside Marlene, the cold dismissal that he noticed it all. And he waited. The evening continued, golden light fading into twilight. Leary laughed with her bridesmaids. Heron gave a toast that dripped with legacy and self-congratulation. Tradition, he declared, means knowing what to bring forward and what to leave behind. The guests nodded in elegant agreement. Marlene Wilkes remained quiet. She had traditions, too. Ones born not from wealth, but endurance. Sorian was their product, and her silence now wasn't defeat. It was anticipation. Then came the shift. The coordinator stepped onto the stage, her voice echoing across the gardens. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, "we are deeply honored to welcome a special guest tonight. A force in industry, philanthropy, and social justice. Someone whose quiet impact has transformed lives." Heads turned. Whispers rose. The man in the charcoal coat stood, eyes widened. Even Valencia straightened. But instead of moving toward the stage, he turned toward Marlene Wilkes and bowed. Leary caught the movement and blinked in confusion. Heron's face turned red, but before he could muster a response, the entire room had turned their attention to Osric. Sorian stood frozen, his fingers tightening around the edge of his drink. This was not part of the plan. This was not how the night was supposed to unfold. The coordinator, flustered, quickly adjusted the mic in her hand, but the air felt thick with tension. No one had expected this. No one had expected him to bow to Marlene. Osric Marrow, though, held the gaze of the Vexmores, and then made his way across the room to Marlene. The sound of his footsteps seemed louder than they were, resonating through the silence. As he reached her, he offered a small but knowing smile. "I've been waiting for this," he said, his voice low, but cleared. Marlene's gaze softened, and her lips curled into the faintest of smiles. She reached out, accepting his hand. The crowd watched in hushed wonder, realizing something was changing. Something monumental was unfolding before them. Marlene had never been ordinary. The Vexmoors had misjudged her, overlooked her, and soon they would learn just how foolish that had been. Before the night was over, they would understand why her presence had been so vital to the evening. She wasn't simply Sorian's grandmother. She was a woman who had weathered every storm life could throw at her. And now, with Osric Marrow at her side, the Vexmoors were about to face a reckoning they never saw coming. The night was far from over. The atmosphere at Valebrook Crest had changed. The elegance that once defined the evening now laced with discomfort. What had begun as just another high society gathering was now heavy with the weight of a revelation that none had expected. Marlene Wilkes had quietly shifted the balance of power in the room. Guests, once caught up in polite conversation and champagne toasts, now sat uncomfortably. Whispers passed like ripples in water, and eyes darted between each other. The once unchallenged elite now exposed. The grand estate, lush and full of beauty, had become a stage where the Vexmoors' true nature was being revealed for all to see. Sorian Halbridge stood frozen, the champagne glass in his hand trembling slightly as he watched Osric Marrow, a man few knew, but whose presence was undeniable, move purposefully towards Marlene. The crowd had been stunned into silence, their attention entirely diverted. It wasn't just a simple greeting. It was a gesture laden with years of respect, admiration, and something far deeper than anyone had anticipated. Marlene, calm and poised as always, accepted Osric's hand. Her earlier silence spoke volumes, but it was her actions now that would reshape the evening entirely. "I've been waiting for this," Osric's voice echoed clearly, his tone both firm and knowing. "This is the woman who built empires. Some of you may have heard her name whispered in the corridors of power, but none of you truly know who she is." The guests, who had dismissed Marlene so easily, now found themselves unable to look away. What had once seemed like an inconsequential presence was now the very center of attention. Marlene's dignity was a stark contrast to the arrogance that had defined the Vexmoors. Heron Vexmoor, the family patriarch, sat stiffly at the table, his earlier smirk replaced by a deep frown. He, like the others, had underestimated her, and now it was clear just how wrong they had been. "You've built wealth," Osric continued, his gaze sweeping across the room. "But wealth isn't what defines a legacy. It's what you leave behind, the lives you touch, the people you raise up. This woman, Marlene Wilkes, has done more for this world than any of you ever will." The silence that followed hung thick in the air. The guests exchanged glances, the weight of guilt pressing down on them. They had all witnessed the subtle dismissals, the coldness, the refusal to acknowledge Marlene's presence. And now, those actions felt more shameful than any ostentatious display of wealth they had once prided themselves on. Marlene's seat at the table, far from the family dais, was both a physical and symbolic separation. Her efforts to integrate into their world, the quiet grace she displayed despite their open disdain, had come full circle. And now, as the Vexmoors' ignorance had come to light, the door they had tried to shut was wide open, and they could never close it again, for all their self-made grandeur. The Vexmoors stood exposed. Their wealth, their status, it meant nothing compared to the true power Marlene wielded. The contrast was undeniable. Leary Vexmoor, her face flushed with realization, looked from her parents to the guests, her eyes full of shame. For all their wealth, they had missed the most important thing: character. Marlene had shown that in abundance, quietly and without fanfare. Leary's gaze shifted to Sorian, and the weight of her actions fell upon him too. He had invited his grandmother to the wedding, but even he hadn't understood the depth of her influence until this moment. Richard Vexmoor, his earlier smugness now evaporated, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. The woman he had once regarded as beneath him had just been revealed to be far beyond him in every way that truly mattered. The man who thought wealth could buy him anything was now learning that some things, like true respect, couldn't be purchased. In the growing silence, Olivia Vexmoor, Leary's younger sister, whispered to her brother, her voice laced with regret. "I should have known. I should have seen it." Michael Halbridge, Sorian's cousin, couldn't remain silent any longer. His voice cut through the stillness, calm but powerful. "You were so focused on appearances, on how everything looked on the surface. You ignored the very woman who could have taught you the greatest lesson of all. The Vexmores stiffened. It was one thing to be embarrassed, but it was another to have their entire worldview shattered. For years, they had prided themselves on their elevated status, and now they were facing the uncomfortable reality that they had been blind to what truly mattered. The carefree atmosphere of the wedding had been replaced by something much heavier. Guests who had once been indifferent now whispered their apologies amongst themselves. They had witnessed more than just a family's disgrace. They had witnessed a life-altering moment, one that would change everything. The very same people who had been dismissive of Marlene now found themselves craving her approval. Victoria Vexmore, still reeling from the shock, tried to smooth over the tension with a strained smile. "Marlene, we had no idea," she said, her voice shaky, the facade of aristocratic charm crumbling. Marlene met her gaze with an unreadable expression. "I know," she responded simply, but her words carried more weight than any apology could have. Heron, who had been sitting with a sharp smirk all evening, finally stood and made his way toward Marlene. He extended his hand, his smile forced. "Madam Wilkes," he said, though the words felt empty, hollow. Marlene glanced at his outstretched hand before looking to Osric Marrow, who stood by her side with unwavering pride. Without a word, she turned her attention back to her dessert, dismissing the gesture entirely. Her silence spoke louder than anything that had been said or done up to that point. The Vexmores, once accustomed to being the center of attention, were now relegated to the periphery. The tables had turned, and the room, once filled with their laughter and whispers, was now filled with a heavy, uncomfortable silence. The realization that they were no longer the most important people in the room was a bitter pill to swallow. By the time the evening came to a close, it was clear. Wealth could buy luxury, but it couldn't buy respect. True power came from something deeper, something the Vexmores had yet to fully comprehend. Marlene Wilkes had shown them that there was more to life than status and money, and that lesson would linger in the minds of the guests long after the final toast had been made.